grandfather clock in the corner of the Holverton dining hall struck 8, the sound heavy, rhythmic, and terribly hollow beneath the vaulted ceiling. 60 guests sat along the polished mahogany table, a glittering assembly of old money-sharp jewels and even as sharper tongues. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison, expensive perfume, and the quiet electric hum of high society anticipation. At the center of it, all surrounded by the crushing weight of ancestral portraits, staring down from the oak-paneled walls, sat Elara Vance. Her faded silver silk dress caught the flickering candlelight, a stark contrast to the blinding opulence of the room she supposedly ruled as the Duchess of Ashford. It was an old dress, meticulously maintained but undeniably outdated, a silent testament to the years she had spent quietly patching the leaks in a sinking ship. Beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, her hands were trembling. She kept them pressed firmly against her lap, her long fingers curled inward so tightly that her pale fingernails bit into her own palms, leaving crescent-shaped marks in her skin. A single drop of dark red wine had spilled onto her left cuff just moments earlier. It spread slowly, sinking into the silver fabric like a fresh, undeniable bruise. Elara stared at it. She focused her entire existence on that small expanding stain to anchor herself to the present. Because if she looked up, if she lifted her eyes even a fraction of an inch, she would have to look at him. Arthur Halverton, the Duke of Ashford, stood at the head of the long table. He tapped his heavy crystal glass with a silver spoon. The ringing sound cut through the low murmur of conversation, commanding instant, absolute silence. He was smiling. It was the same polished, breathtakingly arrogant smile that had charmed her a decade ago. It was the smile of a man who believed the world existed entirely for his consumption. He smoothed the lapels of his immaculate navy dinner jacket, his pale grey eyes sweeping over the room, absorbing the adoration of his peers. He looked like a king. He looked like a man who had not spent the last 3 years secretly drowning in a terrifying ocean of ancestral debt, family, esteemed friends, and honored guests. Arthur began his voice, a rich, perfectly modulated baritone that resonated through the grand hall. I asked you all here tonight under the guise of our annual autumn banquet, but the truth is, tonight marks a transition, a difficult but necessary pivot in the history of the Halverton legacy. Elara's throat closed. The air in her lungs turned to glass sharp and suffocating. She knew what was coming. She had felt the shift in the house for weeks. The whispered conversations ending abruptly when she entered a room, the pitying glances from the senior staff, the sudden inexplicable absence of her husband from their private quarters. But knowing the blade is falling does not stop it from cutting. Arthur reached into his waistcoat, his fingers brushing against the gold pocket watch he compulsively checked. He didn't look at Elara. Not once. He addressed the room, his tone shifting into one of practiced melancholic gravity. For generations, this estate has stood as a beacon of our family's strength. But times change and the burdens of maintaining such a legacy require difficult sacrifices. They require alliances that ensure our survival. They require a future. Arthur paused, letting the silence stretch for dramatic effect. It is with a heavy heart, but a clear mind that I must announce the formal annulment of my marriage to Elara. The words struck the room like a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled down the length of the mahogany table. 60 pairs of eyes snapped toward Elara in violent synchronization. She did not flinch. She kept her gaze fixed on the wine stain on her cuff. Her spine locked into a terrifyingly rigid line. Her breath turned incredibly shallow, barely enough to keep her from passing out, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She would not cry, not here, not in front of the people who had always considered her an unworthy, penniless addition to their golden circle. Elara and I have come to an understanding. Arthur continued the lie rolling off his tongue with sickening ease. She has always been a quiet presence, unsuited for the crushing demands of our world. And our world requires a savior. He extended his right hand. From the seat directly to his left, a seat that traditionally belonged to the Duchess, which Elara had been quietly asked to vacate this evening, under the pretense of unseating logistics. A woman stood up, Lady Cecilia Montgomery. She was 24, radiant and dripping in new money. She wore a stunning ivory gown encrusted with pearl embroidery that caught every particle of light in the room. Her golden blonde hair was elaborately curled, framing a flawless, doll-like face. She placed her delicate, perfectly manicured hand into Arthur's. On her ring finger, an enormous diamond caught the candlelight, flashing with blinding, vulgar triumph. "I'm thrilled to announce my engagement to Lady Cecilia," Arthur declared, his voice returning to its booming confidence. "Her family's extraordinary generosity and vision will breathe new life into the Halverton estate. Together we will restore this house to its ultimate glory." The room erupted. Applause shattered the silence, loud and enthusiastic. Crystal glasses were raised. Men cheered. Women offered Cecilia brilliant, approving smiles. They were clapping for the preservation of their social order. They were clapping for the influx of the Montgomery fortune, which would keep their luxurious parties running. They were clapping for Elara's erasure. Cecilia smiled a sweetly vicious curve of her lips. She looked down the table, her wide blue eyes locking onto Elara. It was a look of pure, unadulterated pity mixed with absolute victory. "Arthur, darling!" Cecilia murmured, her voice loud enough to carry over the dying applause. "We shouldn't forget our promise. It wouldn't be right to leave her, with nothing, especially after she tried her best to fit in." Arthur nodded, adopting an expression of magnanimous grace. He gestured to a silver tray held by the head butler, who stepped forward with practiced mechanical stiffness. The butler walked the long, agonizing distance down the side of the table, stopping precisely beside Elara's chair. On the silver tray rested a single crisp piece of paper, a bank check. "Elara," Arthur said finally, looking at her. His grey eyes were cold, devoid of any shared history, any shared nights, any shared struggles. "Cecilia and I have arranged a severance. It is a more than generous sum. Enough for you to purchase a modest cottage in the countryside. Consider it a charitable gift for your years of quiet companionship. We expect you to vacate the premises by tomorrow afternoon." The room held its breath. The silence was no longer anticipatory. It was suffocating, dripping with social cruelty. 60 aristocrats watched her, waiting for the penniless woman to break, to weep, to beg, or to gratefully snatch the charity check like a starving dog. Elara looked at the piece of paper. The sum written on it was an insult. It was a fraction of the debt she had quietly absorbed to keep the roof over their heads. For 3 years, while Arthur hosted lavish hunts and bought thoroughbreds. On credit, Elara had been trading, investing, and maneuvering her own hidden inheritance. She had purchased his debts through anonymous holding companies to protect him from bankruptcy. She owned the mortgage on the very dining hall he was standing in. She owned the tapestries, the portraits, the silver spoons they were eating with. She owned the ground beneath Cecilia's ivory satin shoes. And he was offering her a cottage. A slow, chilling numbness began to spread outward from her chest, freezing her veins. The trembling in her hands stopped completely. The anxious, over-apologetic woman who had spent a decade trying to earn the love of a man incapable of giving it simply ceased to exist. In her place, something cold, absolute, and deeply dangerous took root. She felt the heavy weight of the vintage silver key resting deep in the hidden pocket of her dress. The key to the estate's financial archives. Her archives. "Take it! Elara?" Arthur urged, his tone shifting, slightly edged with patronizing annoyance. "It is the best you are going to get. You must know you don't belong here anymore." Cecilia leaned her head against Arthur's shoulder. "It's all right if you need to cry, Elara. We understand it's a shock to return to your normal life." A low chuckle rippled through the guests. A few women hid their smirks behind lace fans. The Dowager Duchess at the far end of the table openly rolled her eyes. Elara did not cry. She did not reach for the check. She slowly lifted her head. The movement was so deliberate, so devoid of the expected humiliation, that the chuckles died in the throats of the guests. She looked at Arthur. Her deep brown eyes were entirely empty of tears, empty of warmth, empty of the desperate devotion he had taken for granted. They were flat and dark as a winter ocean. She looked at the diamond on Cecilia's finger. She knew exactly which line of credit Arthur had illegally extended to purchase it. "A modest cottage," Elara repeated softly. She never raised her voice. She didn't have to. The terrifying calm in her tone forced the entire room to lean in, straining to hear her. "Yes," Arthur said, his jaw tightening, unsettled by her lack of hysterics. "A fresh start." Elara slowly uncurled her fingers. She placed her pale hands flat on the mahogany table, the wine-stained cuff resting clearly in the candlelight for everyone to see. She did not look at the check again. "How incredibly generous of you, your grace!" She whispered, her voice slicing through the heavy air like a razor through silk. The words hung in the air, barely a whisper, yet they seemed to reverberate against the heavy oak paneling of the dining hall. "How incredibly generous of you, your grace!" Arthur's polished smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. A tiny, almost imperceptible crease appeared between his brows. He had orchestrated this public execution with absolute precision. He had anticipated sobbing. He had prepared for a hysterical outburst. Perhaps a desperate plea for him to reconsider, which he would gracefully and firmly deny in front of his peers, cementing his status as the tragic but resolute patriarch, making a hard choice for his lineage. He had not prepared for Elara to sit there like a statue carved from ice. "It is practical, Elara," Arthur said, his voice hardening, trying to reclaim the narrative of the benevolent ruler. "Cecilia and I wish to see you comfortably settled. It is the proper thing to do. Take the check." Cecilia leaned forward, her heavy diamond flashing under the chandelier. She arranged her delicate features into a mask of cloying theatrical sympathy. "Please, Elara, don't let your pride make this harder than it has to be. We know you come from humbler means. We just want to ensure you won't be on the streets. It would reflect terribly on the Halverton name if Arthur's former wife were found living in squalor." A few of the guests nodded in solemn agreement, murmuring their approval of the young heiress's remarkable charity. Lord Harrington, a man whose own gambling debts Elara had secretly purchased 6 months ago to keep him out of debtor's prison, openly scoffed. "The girl should show some gratitude," he muttered to his neighbor, loud enough for the entire table to hear. Most men would have tossed her out with nothing but the clothes on her back. Elara slowly turned her head to look at Lord Harrington, her deep brown eyes locked onto his flush, arrogant face. She held his gaze for 3 long seconds. In her mind, she pictured the exact page in her ledger where his catastrophic financial ruin was neatly documented in black ink. Harrington shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his sneer faltering under the weight of her dead-eyed stare. He looked away first, taking a sudden nervous sip of his wine. Elara turned her attention back to the silver tray hovering beside her. The butler's hand was perfectly steady, but she could see the faint sheen of sweat on the man's brow. He knew, as the rest of the senior staff knew, who actually managed the accounts. He knew who kept the fires burning in this colossal freezing mausoleum of a house. Slowly, deliberately, Elara reached out. Her hand was entirely steady now. The drop of dark red wine on her silver silk cuff caught the light, looking violently out of place against her pale skin. She did not touch the check. Instead, she placed her index finger against the edge of the silver tray and gently pushed it away. "I will not be needing your charity, Arthur," Elara said, her voice dropping another octave, settling into a tone of devastating calm. "Keep the money. I assure you, you are going to need every single penny of it much more than I will." A sharp, collective intake of breath swept through the room. It was an insult. A blatant, unacceptable insult to the Duke of Ashford in his own dining hall. "Have you lost your mind?" The Dowager Duchess Eleanor snapped from the far end of the table, her powdered face contorting with rage. She struck the floor with her silver-headed cane. "You ungrateful, wretched creature! My son offers you a lifeline out of the goodness of his heart to save you from the destitution you were born to, and you dare to speak to him with such insolence. You are nothing without the Halverton name. Nothing." Elara slowly rose to her feet. The wooden legs of her heavy dining chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. The sound was harsh, violent, and unapologetic. She stood tall, pulling her shoulders, back her spine, aligning perfectly. In her faded silver dress amidst the sea of vibrant jewels and rich velvets, she should have looked small. She should have looked defeated. Instead, she looked like the only person in the room who possessed actual gravity. "I'm entirely aware of what the Halverton name is worth." "Eleanor," Elara replied, not bothering to use the woman's title. The omission was a deliberate, calculated strike. The Dowager Duchess gasped, clutching the pearls at her throat, as if she had been physically struck. Arthur slammed his hand flat against the table, the silverware rattling violently. The mask of the gracious gentleman finally slipped, revealing the cruel entitled boy underneath. "That is enough, Elara." You will not disrespect my mother in this house. You have overstayed your welcome. If you will not accept my generosity, then you will leave with exactly what you brought into this marriage. Nothing. Now get out." Cecilia shrank back slightly, playing the frightened, delicate bride, though her eyes remained fixed on Elara with venomous delight. "Arthur, please don't upset yourself. She's just lashing out because she's hurt. It's pathetic, really." Elara did not look at Cecilia. From the moment the annulment was announced, Elara had recognized the heiress for exactly what she was: a walking, talking bank account that Arthur was desperately trying to drain to save his drowning legacy. Cecilia thought she was buying a fairy tale. She had no idea she was buying a ticket on a sinking ship. Elara felt no anger toward the girl, only a cold clinical pity. Cecilia was irrelevant. "I am leaving Arthur," Elara said quietly. She stepped back from the table. She looked down at the empty chair she had occupied for the last 3 years. The chair where she had sat through endless, agonizing dinners, politely eating terrible food, while listening to the men around her boast about fortunes they no longer possessed. She looked at the heavy linen napkin she had neatly folded beside her plate. She left it there. She was leaving all of it. Without another word, Elara turned her back on the Duke of Ashford, the new heiress, and the 60 guests who were waiting for her to shatter. She began the long walk toward the towering oak doors at the far end of the dining hall. The silence that followed her was thick and suffocating. It was the silence of predators, watching wounded prey waiting for a stumble, a single sign of weakness. Elara gave them nothing. Her posture was flawless. Her footsteps were measured silent against the Persian rugs. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her eyes fixed entirely on the heavy brass handles of the exit. As she passed the ancestral portraits lining the walls, she didn't feel the crushing weight of their judgment anymore. For years, Arthur had used these paintings to remind her of her insignificance, telling her that she was merely a footnote in a grand centuries-old history. But tonight, looking at the stern faces of the long-dead Halverton dukes, Elara felt a profound sense of irony. They weren't glaring at her in judgment. If the dead could see, they would be weeping for the fool at the head of the table who had just thrown away the only person holding the deed to their legacy. She reached the massive oak doors. The 2 footmen stationed there scrambled to open them, their faces pale, their eyes cast downward, in supreme discomfort. They pulled the heavy doors inward. Elara stepped across the threshold into the dark, drafty hallway. The moment she cleared the doorway, the tension in the dining hall snapped. Laughter erupted behind her. It wasn't the polite, muffled chuckles from before. It was loud, cruel, and completely uninhibited. "Good riddance." She heard Lord Harrington boom over the noise. "Did you see her face like a frozen fish?" Another voice mocked. Then came Arthur's voice, rising above the cruel symphony, desperate to reclaim his stage. "My friends, let us not waste another moment of this exquisite evening on the past. Please raise your glasses to the future of the Halverton estate, to Cecilia." To Cecilia, the room echoed in a roaring, unified chant. Glasses clinked. The celebration of her erasure had officially begun. The footmen slowly pulled the heavy oak doors shut. The thick wood swallowed the sound of the laughter, reducing the roaring party to a muffled, distant hum. Elara stood alone in the cold, shadowy corridor. For the first time all evening, she allowed herself to close her eyes. She inhaled a long, shuddering breath of the damp, drafty air. The adrenaline that had kept her spine straight and her voice steady began to recede, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. Her heart, which had been beating with slow, terrifying precision, suddenly fluttered wildly in her chest. She raised her left hand, her fingers gently brushing against the damp, dark red wine stain on her cuff. The fabric was ruined. The stain would never wash out. It was a permanent mark of the moment Arthur Halverton had tried to destroy her. A single tear burned at the corner of her eye, a remnant of the woman who had loved him. The woman who had spent endless nights worrying about his stress, his debts, his failing health. Elara reached up and wiped the tear away with a painfully slow, deliberate motion. The gesture was final. It was the absolute, irreversible death of her mercy. She lowered her hand and slipped it into the hidden pocket of her faded and silver skirt. Her fingers closed around the heavy, cold metal of the vintage silver key. The key to the estate's financial archives. Her archives. Arthur had just announced his engagement to save his house. He didn't know that the house had already been saved 3 years ago, by the very woman he had just publicly humiliated. And he certainly didn't know that the holding company, which had quietly bought up every single one of his catastrophic debts, every mortgage on every acre of Halverton Lest, every lien against every portrait and silver spoon, was solely owned by Elara Vance. She had bought his debt to protect him. She had intended to give it to him to free him from the crushing weight of his ancestors' failures. Now she was going to collect. Elara opened her eyes. The exhaustion was gone. The trembling was a forgotten memory. The hallway was dark, illuminated only by the faint flickering light of wall sconces, but her path had never been clearer. It was 8:15 p.m.? The bank holding the final, irrevocable transfer documents, the documents that transitioned the Halverton debt into immediate actionable foreclosure status, upon default, opened its private high net worth channels precisely at 5 a.m. She had less than 9 hours. Elara turned away from the muffled laughter of the dining hall. Her soft footsteps echoed against the marble floor as she walked deeper into the cold, sprawling belly of the mansion, heading straight for the archives. Let them drink their expensive wine. Let Cecilia flaunt her unpaid-for diamond. Let Arthur bask in his hollow victory. By dawn, the true owner of the Halverton estate would be taking her house back. The deeper Elara descended into the east wing of the Halverton estate, the colder the air became. This section of the colossal house was largely abandoned, unheated to save on the exorbitant coal expenses that Arthur refused to acknowledge. The grand echoing corridors of the upper floors gave way to narrow, practical stone passages. There were no ancestral portraits down here, no gilded mirrors or crystal chandeliers to reflect a false sense of prosperity. Down here there was only the bone-deep chill of a house that had been dying for decades. Outside, the autumn wind had finally broken into a full, violent storm. Heavy rain began to lash against the narrow, leaded glass windows, the drops hitting the panes like handfuls of thrown gravel. It was a vicious, unforgiving sound, perfectly matching the rhythm of Elara's racing heart. She walked in absolute silence, her faded silver silk dress making a soft, ghostly rustle against the stone floor. She did not need a lantern to find her way. She knew every crack in the masonry, every uneven stone, every drafty corner of this estate better than the man who claimed to own it. For 3 years, while Arthur slept off his expensive wine in the master's suite, she had walked these halls like a phantom, trying to calculate how many more months they could survive, before the creditors finally breached the gates. She reached the end of the corridor. Before her stood a heavy, iron-bound oak door, the entrance to the estate's historical and financial archives. Elara withdrew her hand from her pocket. Her fingers were stiff from the cold as she gripped the heavy, vintage silver key. As she slid it into the ancient lock, it turned with a satisfying metallic click that echoed sharply in the empty hallway. She pushed the heavy door inward and stepped into the absolute darkness of the room. She moved automatically to the small wooden table near the entrance, her hands finding the familiar shape of a kerosene lamp and a box of matches. She struck a match. The sudden flare of orange light illuminated her face, pale, hollowed by exhaustion, but set with a terrifying, glacial resolve. She lit the wick, adjusted the glass chimney, and picked up the lamp. The archives room was vast and suffocatingly dense. Towering mahogany shelves reached up to the vaulted ceiling packed with centuries of Halverton history. Leather-bound ledgers rolled architectural blueprints, and stacks of legal correspondence sat in quiet, dusty rows. It was the true heart of the estate, not the dining hall upstairs where aristocrats played at being powerful. This was where the actual power resided, in the numbers, the contracts, the undeniable math of wealth and ruin. Elara walked past the shelves, containing the records of the first, second, and third Dukes of Ashford. She ignored the prosperous ledgers of the 1800s. She walked straight to the back of the room, to a heavy, fireproof iron safe hidden behind a plain wooden desk. She set the lamp down on the desk. The flickering light cast long dancing shadows across the stone walls, making the room feel alive, restless. Elara looked down at her left wrist. The dark red wine stain on her silver cuff had dried, stiffening the delicate silk. She traced the edge of the stain with her right index finger. The physical reality of the fabric grounded her, pulling her back to the humiliation at the dining table just hours ago. "A modest cottage," she whispered to the empty room. The sound of her own voice, steady and devoid of tears, triggered something deep within her memory. A flashback sharp, and uninvited, pulled her back to a night exactly 3 years ago in this very room. The air in the archives had tasted of dust and despair. It was 3 a.m. Arthur was sitting in the chair where Elara stood now, his head buried in his hands, a half-empty bottle of scotch sitting precariously on a stack of unpaid bills. He had been weeping. The great Duke of Ashford reduced to a sobbing, terrified child. "It's gone, Elara." He had choked out his voice thick with alcohol and panic. "My father hid the extent of it, and my investments, they failed. The London Bank is calling them mortgages. All of them. They're going to auction the estate. They're going to take the house, the land, everything. I'll be the Duke who lost Halverton." Elara had stood behind him, her hands gently resting on his shaking shoulders. She had felt his terror as if it were her own. She loved him so completely, so foolishly, that the thought of his public destruction physically ached in her chest. "We will find a way, Arthur," she had murmured softly, kissing the top of his head. He had laughed a bitter, ugly sound. "A way with what your family's money dried up a decade ago." "There is no miracle, Elara. We are finished." He didn't know. He hadn't bothered to learn that, while her father's visible businesses had failed her grandfather's quiet, aggressive investments in overseas shipping and foreign railways, had compounded in secret accounts for over 20 years. Elara was not the penniless bride the aristocracy believed her to be. She was quietly, extraordinarily wealthy. But she had kept it hidden, knowing that Arthur's fragile ego could never tolerate a wife richer than himself. That night, after Arthur had passed out from the scotch Elara had taken the ledgers, she had contacted her private wealth managers in Geneva. Over the next 3 weeks, a newly formed anonymous entity named Vance Holdings swept through the London financial district. Vance Holdings aggressively bought out every single one of the Halverton estate's debts, consolidating the mortgages, the personal loans, the liens against the artwork. The bank was paid in full. When the anonymous lawyers presented Arthur with the newly structured, highly lenient debt package from Vance Holdings, he had celebrated for a week. He thought a miracle had occurred. He thought his natural aristocratic luck had saved him. He never once questioned who stood behind the faceless corporate entity, and Elara, wanting only to protect his pride and keep their home safe, had never told him. She had signed away the bulk of her secret fortune to keep a roof over the head of a man who 3 years later would try to pay her off with a charity check and hand her life unto a 24-year-old heiress. The memory dissolved, leaving Elara alone in the cold, rain-streaked room. She stopped tracing the wine stain. The lingering phantom of the woman who had kissed Arthur's shaking shoulders evaporated into the freezing air. Love was a liability she could no longer afford. Mercy was a luxury he had not earned. Elara reached for the combination dial on the heavy iron safe. Her fingers moved with practiced mechanical precision. Click! Turn! Click! Turn! Click! She pulled the heavy metal door open. Inside, sitting alone on the top shelf, was a thick black leather-bound ledger. Stamped on the front in faded gold lettering was the name Vance Holdings, Master Asset Registry. She lifted the ledger. It was incredibly heavy, containing hundreds of pages of legal contracts, property deeds, and financial covenants. She placed it squarely in the center of the wooden desk, right beneath the golden glow of the kerosene lamp. Elara pulled back the heavy leather cover. She bypassed the early pages detailing the initial buyouts. She turned straight to the final section of the ledger, to the specific lethal covenants she had instructed her lawyers to embed within the debt restructuring. Clause 4, subsection B, payable on demand. Because Vance Holdings had been so lenient asking for minimal interest payments over the last 3 years to allow Arthur to recover the entire consolidated principal of the Halverton debt was legally categorized as a demand loan. It meant the creditor could at any moment, without warning and without cause, demand the repayment of the entire sum in full within 24 hours. Failure to produce the total sum would trigger an immediate, uncontestable forfeiture of all collateral. And the collateral was everything. The country estate, the London townhouse, the hunting lodges, the art collection, the silver on the dining table, the very bed Arthur was likely leading Cecilia to at this exact moment. For 3 years, Elara had kept the blade sheathed. Tonight, she was dropping the guillotine. She opened the desk drawer and withdrew a fountain pen and a stack of crisp, blank legal stationery bearing the Vance Holdings letterhead. Outside, the storm raged harder, the wind howling around the stone corners of the east wing, rattling the window panes. Inside, the only sound was the sharp, rhythmic scratching of Elara's pen against the heavy paper. She drafted the notice of demand with clinical, flawless legal precision. She did not use emotional language. There was no anger in her handwriting. The ink flowed in sharp, perfectly slanted lines. She demanded the immediate repayment of £4,200,000 sterling, a sum she knew Arthur could not raise, even if he sold his own soul, let alone Cecilia's newly promised dowry. When she finished the primary notice, she began drafting the secondary documents. The writ of execution, the eviction mandate. It was 2 a.m. Far above her, the vibrations of the party had finally ceased. The guests would be retiring to the estate's numerous guest rooms, drunk on expensive champagne and high on the drama of the Duchess's public dismissal. They were sleeping soundly under Elara's roof, wrapped in Elara's linens, completely unaware that the ground beneath them had just shifted irrevocably. A faint sound drifted down through the thick stone ceiling. Footsteps on the grand staircase. She recognized the heavy, confident stride. Arthur. He was likely walking Cecilia to the lavishly prepared guest suite, murmuring promises of a golden future, assuring her that the nuisance of his first wife would be gone by morning. Elara's hand paused, hovering over the paper. She looked up at the ceiling. A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of her lips, a smile that never reached her dark, empty eyes. "I will be gone by morning, Arthur," she whispered to the ceiling, "but I am taking the house with me." She lowered her pen to the bottom of the final document. The line required the signature of the sole proprietor of Vance Holdings, authorizing the immediate deployment of the royal bailiffs and the bank's execution team at the start of the business day. Elara did not hesitate. Her hand did not tremble. She pressed the nib of the pen to the paper and signed her name in bold, sweeping strokes. Elara Vance. She blew gently on the wet ink, watching it dry from a gleaming black to a dull, permanent slate. The deed was done. The mechanism of Arthur's absolute destruction had been activated. She closed the heavy, black ledger with a loud, satisfying thud. She gathered the signed execution documents and slipped them into a sealed leather folio. Now there was nothing left to do but wait for the sun to rise. Elara sat back in the wooden chair, folding her hands over the leather folio in her lap. The kerosene lamp flickered, casting a golden light across her serene, untouchable face. She let the cold of the archives seep into her bones, matching the temperature of her own heart. The storm hammered against the glass, a furious symphony accompanying the turning of the tide. The clock was ticking toward dawn. And at 5 a.m., the Duke of Ashford was going to learn the true cost of humiliating his Duchess. 3 floors above the freezing stone-walled archives, the master suite of the Halverton estate was suffocatingly warm. A massive fire roared in the marble hearth, casting a rich golden glow over the heavy velvet drapes and the sprawling 4-poster bed. Arthur Halverton stood by the window, a crystal snifter of vintage cognac in his hand. He took a slow, deeply satisfying sip, feeling the expensive liquor burn a triumphant path down his throat. He reached into his waistcoat with his free hand and pulled out his gold pocket watch, clicking the intricate casing open. It was 3:30 a.m. He snapped the watch shut and smiled at his own reflection in the dark, rain-battered window pane. He had done it. The most difficult, unsavory task of his entire aristocratic life was over. He had cleanly excised the dead weight of his past, and he had done so with a masterful display of public authority. There had been no screaming, no shattered glass, no scandalous hysterics that the gossips could feast upon for the next decade. Elara had simply walked out, exactly as a penniless, thoroughly defeated woman should. "Arthur, darling, come away from the draft," Cecilia murmured from the center of the room. She was sitting at the vanity, wearing a silk robe that cost more than the annual wages of the estate's entire household staff. She was admiring her reflection, tilting her left hand to catch the firelight on her enormous diamond engagement ring. "I was just thinking about the future, my love," Arthur said, turning away from the storm outside. He walked over and placed a kiss on the crown of her golden blonde hair. Cecilia sighed happily, leaning back against him. "It is going to be magnificent. Though we simply must do something about that dining hall. It is so dreadfully dark. We will tear down those heavy tapestries, paint the oak panels a modern cream, and perhaps bring in some new art. Something vibrant. Whatever you wish. Arthur agreed smoothly, his eyes drifting over the luxurious room. With your family's investment, the Halverton estate will be the absolute envy of the country once more. Cecilia turned to the diamond ring again, her sweet doll-like face hardening into a brief, dismissive sneer. It really was a pity about Elara's behavior tonight. Refusing your generous check like that. I suppose pride is the only thing the poor have left to cling to. Arthur chuckled, a low, arrogant sound. Let her have her pride. By tomorrow afternoon she will be on a train back to whatever obscure quiet life she crawled out of. We will never have to speak her name again. He took another sip of his cognac completely, and utterly oblivious to the fact that the floor he was standing on the bed he intended to sleep in, and the very cognac he was drinking had not belonged to him for 3 years. 2 floors below them, the grandfather clock in the grand hallway ticked with heavy, rhythmic precision. Elara walked through the silent corridors of the West Wing. She moved like a ghost, making no sound, leaving no trace. The house felt fundamentally different to her now. For a decade, these walls had felt like a magnificent, inescapable cage. She had tiptoed through these halls, desperate not to disturb the delicate sensibilities of the Halverton ancestors, desperate to prove she was worthy of occupying their sacred space. Now, tracing her fingers lightly along the silk wallpaper, she felt no reverence. She felt only the cold, hard reality of ownership. It was not a cage, it was an asset, and its current occupants were merely trespassing. She reached her private dressing room, a small secondary chamber at the far end of the guest corridor. Arthur had practically moved her out of the master suite months ago under the guise of his restless sleeping habits, a thinly veiled excuse she had silently accepted. Elara closed the door behind her and locked it. The room was dark, but she did not light a lamp. The flashes of lightning from the storm outside provided enough illumination for what she needed to do. She stood in front of the tall, gilded floor mirror. In the erratic flashes of silver light, she looked at the woman in the glass. The faded silver silk dress hung on her frame, conservative, outdated, and stained. She raised her left arm, looking at the dark red blotch on her cuff. The drop of wine Arthur had caused her to spill when he shattered her life. It was the uniform of a victim. The uniform of a woman who apologized for her own existence. Elara reached behind her neck and unfastened the top hook of the dress. With slow, deliberate movements, she let the silver silk slide off her shoulders. It pooled at her feet in a pale, ruined heap. She stepped out of it, leaving the dress, the wine stain, and the last 10 years of her life crumpled on the hardwood floor. She would never wear it again. She would never be that woman again. She walked over to a heavy iron-clasped travel trunk, tucked in the corner of the room. She had packed it days ago, anticipating the inevitable end of her marriage, though she hadn't known exactly how or when Arthur would wield the blade. She unlocked the trunk and threw back the lid. Inside, meticulously folded in tissue paper, lay a wardrobe Arthur Halverton had never seen. The wardrobe of a woman who controlled international shipping lines and foreign railways. The wardrobe of the sole proprietor of Vance Holdings. Elara lifted a tailored emerald green velvet suit from the trunk. The fabric was breathtakingly rich, heavy, and undeniably expensive. It was a garment designed not for a wife, but for a conqueror. She dressed in silence. The trousers fit flawlessly. The matching velvet blazer featured sharp, structured shoulders that demanded perfect, unyielding posture. Underneath, she wore a crisp, high-collared black silk blouse. She fastened the buttons with steady, clinical precision. She turned back to the gilded mirror. The lightning flashed again, illuminating a stranger. The trembling faded. Duchess was gone. The woman staring back at her was a towering architectural force of nature. The emerald green velvet absorbed the shadows of the room, making her look dangerously vibrant. Elara reached up and pulled the pins from her hair. The severe, restrictive twist she had worn for years unraveled, letting her dark, auburn hair fall freely in thick, powerful waves over her sharp shoulders. She did not look like she belonged in the Halverton estate. She looked like she owned it. Elara picked up the sealed leather folio containing the demand notices and the execution orders. She checked a small silver wristwatch she had retrieved from the trunk. It was 4:45 a.m. The storm outside was beginning to break, the violent driving rain softening into a freezing, relentless mist. The sky was turning the color of bruised iron, signaling the approach of a brutally cold dawn. Elara left the dressing room, leaving the silver dress on the floor. She walked down the grand curving staircase, her footsteps no longer soft and apologetic. The sharp heels of her black leather boots clicked against the marble with the rhythmic, terrifying cadence of a ticking clock. She bypassed the grand foyer and walked straight down the long servants' corridor, heading toward the heavy iron gates at the rear service entrance of the estate. The air down here was frigid, biting through the velvet of her suit, but Elara did not shiver. Her blood felt like ice water. She reached the heavy wooden door of the rear entrance and pulled it open. The freeing morning mist rolled into the corridor. Outside, the sprawling gravel courtyard was shrouded in grey shadows, but piercing through the gloom were the bright, stark headlights of 4 sleek black motor cars. They sat idling in the cold, their engines emitting a low, powerful hum that vibrated through the damp air. As Elara stepped out onto the stone landing, the doors of the vehicles opened in unison. A dozen men stepped out onto the wet gravel. They did not look like the aristocratic guests upstairs. They were men of business, men of law, and men of execution. They wore sharp, charcoal suits, heavy trench coats, and expressions of absolute unfeeling professionalism. Among them were 4 royal bailiffs, their official badges catching the headlights, entirely indifferent to the aristocratic titles of the people they were about to evict. From the lead car, an older man with silver hair and a razor-sharp profile stepped forward. He carried a secure steel-clasped briefcase. It was Mr. Sterling, the senior partner of the most ruthless law firm in London, and Elara's personal lead counsel for Vance Holdings. He walked up the stone steps, stopping exactly 1 pace below Elara. Despite the freezing mist, he removed his hat, an undeniable gesture of deep, profound respect. "Miss Vance," Sterling said, his voice crisp and clear over the hum of the idling engines. "Mr. Sterling," Elara replied. "Is the bank awake?" Sterling checked his own watch, then looked up, his eyes gleaming with the anticipation of a flawlessly executed trap. "The London Financial District opened its private channels precisely at the top of the hour. We transmitted the notice of demand electronically to the holding bank. And the status of the Halverton debt." Sterling popped the latches on his steel briefcase. He withdrew a single thick document, bearing a heavy red wax seal and the official stamp of the High Court of London. "The Duke of Ashford was given 0 hours to cure the default, as per the covenants you drafted 3 years ago," Sterling stated, handing the document to Elara. "He has failed to produce £4,200,000. The default is now absolute and permanent. The bank has executed the immediate transfer of all collateral." Elara took the heavy document. She ran her thumb over the red wax seal. It felt warm, a stark contrast to the freezing morning air. The property, the land, the assets, and the physical estate itself. Sterling continued, his voice echoing slightly in the damp courtyard, "are now the sole uncontestable property of Vance Holdings. The bailiffs have their mandates. We have the legal authority to clear the premises by force if necessary." Elara looked past the idling black cars, past the iron gates, and out toward the rolling hills of the estate. The bruised iron sky was beginning to crack, revealing the first pale, blinding slivers of the morning sun. Dawn had arrived. The ticking clock had finally struck 0. "Force will not be necessary, Mr. Sterling," Elara said softly, her voice carrying the absolute devastating weight of an apex predator that had just cornered its prey. "The Duke of Ashford is a man who respects the brutality of money above all else. When he sees the math, he will break." She turned around, facing the colossal, imposing structure of the Halverton mansion. The stone walls looked grey and lifeless in the early light. Upstairs, behind the drawn velvet curtains of the master suite, Arthur and Cecilia were likely still asleep, dreaming of their triumphant future. Elara adjusted the lapels of her emerald green velvet suit. She held the execution orders in her left hand, her chin lifting, as the first ray of cold sunlight struck her face. "Come, gentlemen," Elara commanded, her voice ringing out like a judge handing down a fatal sentence. "It is time for breakfast, and the guests have overstayed their welcome." The morning room of the Halverton estate was a masterpiece of aristocratic indulgence. Bathed in the crisp golden light of the early autumn sun, the room smelled of freshly brewed Earl Grey tea, roasted pheasant and warm pastries, arranged meticulously beneath domed silver cloches. At 8:30 a.m., the atmosphere around the long oval breakfast table was thick with self-congratulatory smugness. The most elite guests from the previous night's banquet had stayed over, and they now sat lounging in high-backed, upholstered chairs, nursing their hangovers with expensive coffee. At the head of the table, Arthur Halverton looked impossibly refreshed. He wore a tailored tweed morning jacket, looking every inch the triumphant lord of the manor. Cecilia sat beside him, dressed in a pale pink cashmere sweater, her massive diamond engagement ring catching the morning sunlight and projecting tiny prisms of rainbow light across the white linen tablecloth. "I must say, Arthur," Lord Harrington chuckled, then spreading clotted cream onto a scone, "you handled the unpleasantness last night with remarkable tact. Most women of her background would have broken plates or wept uncontrollably. She simply slinked away. It was almost too easy." "She knows her place, Harrington," the Dowager Duchess Eleanor declared from the opposite end of the table. She sipped her tea, her powdered face fixed in an expression of absolute superiority. "She always knew she was a temporary fixture. A placeholder until my son found a woman of proper breeding and substantial means." She offered Cecilia a warm, ingratiating smile. Cecilia beamed, reaching over to pat Arthur's hand. "I almost feel sorry for her, walking out into the corridor like a ghost. Do you think she has already left the grounds, Arthur?" Arthur leaned back, taking a leisurely sip of his coffee. He felt invincible. "I gave her until the afternoon to pack her meager belongings. I expect she is in her room right now crying over her packed suitcase. I will have the footman escort her to the local train station at noon. We need not spare her another thought." He raised his cup, preparing to propose a light-hearted morning toast to his new bride. He never got the chance. The heavy double doors of the morning room did not open with the polite, silent grace of the household staff. They were shoved apart with a brutal, unceremonious force that sent them crashing against the mahogany wall panels. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. Several guests jumped. Lord Harrington dropped his butter knife. Arthur spilled hot coffee onto his wrist, his head snapping toward the entrance in furious disbelief. "What is the meaning of—" The words died in his throat. Standing in the doorway was a woman Arthur did not recognize. Or rather, a woman he recognized but who possessed an aura so fundamentally alien, so completely devastating, that his brain refused to reconcile the image. It was Elara, but the faded, trembling creature in the stained silver dress was dead. The woman who stood before them was an apex predator. She wore a tailored emerald green velvet suit that seemed to absorb the sunlight, her shoulders sharp and unforgiving. Her dark auburn hair fell in thick, loose waves, framing a face carved from glacial ice. She did not look like a discarded wife. She looked like the executioner, and she was not alone. Flanking her were 4 large men wearing the dark, utilitarian coats of the royal bailiffs, their silver badges gleaming menacingly on their chests. Behind them stood Mr. Sterling, clutching his steel briefcase, his face a mask of lethal corporate efficiency. The silence in the morning room was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The aristocrats stared at the doorway, their minds struggling to process the presence of law enforcement in their sacred, untouchable space. "Elara." Arthur finally managed his voice, a mixture of shock and rising defensive anger. He stood up, throwing his napkin onto the table. "What is this? Have you lost your mind? I told you to be gone by the afternoon, and you dare to barge in here with police." Elara did not answer him immediately. She stepped into the room. Her sharp, leather boots clicked against the hardwood floor with slow, deliberate precision. The bailiffs followed, spreading out along the walls, their hands resting casually near their belts. Cecilia shrank back in her chair, her eyes wide with sudden, unexplainable panic. "Arthur, make her leave! She's scaring me! Guards!" Eleanor barked, striking her cane against the floor. "Where is the household security? Have this mad woman thrown out into the street immediately." Nobody came. The household staff, who had already been briefed by the bailiffs at the service entrance, were nowhere to be seen. Elara walked the length of the room, passing Lord Harrington, passing the trembling guests until she reached the head of the table. She stopped directly across from Arthur. She looked at his flushed, angry face, at the tweed jacket he wore, with such unearned pride. She raised her left hand and dropped the heavy, black, leather-bound ledger onto the center of the breakfast table. Bang! The sheer weight of the book rattled the fine china. A crystal vase of morning roses tipped over, spilling water across the pristine white linen. Arthur flinched, staring down at the faded gold lettering on the leather cover Vance Holdings. Master Asset Registry. I am not here to pack, Arthur, Elara said. Her voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of the slightest tremor. It was the voice of a woman reading a death sentence. I am here to collect. Arthur looked at the ledger, then back at her, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. Collect what? And what does Vance Holdings have to do with you? They are the financial firm that restructured my debt. They are my creditors. Mr. Sterling stepped forward, opening his steel briefcase. He withdrew the heavy document bearing the red wax seal of the High Court and laid it flat on the table right next to Arthur's spilled coffee. Your Grace. Mr. Sterling began, his tone clinically devoid of respect. I am the senior legal counsel for Vance Holdings. As of 5 a.m. this morning, your grace period for the consolidated demand loan expired. You failed to produce the £4,200,000 required to cure the default. Arthur's face went completely white. All the blood drained from his cheeks in a single terrifying rush. He grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. Default. There is no default. The terms of the loan were entirely flexible. Vance Holdings assured me I had years to reorganize my capital. Vance Holdings? Elara interrupted, her dark eyes locking onto his panicked grey ones. Was feeling generous 3 years ago. Because 3 years ago I still believed you were a man worth saving. The room seemed to tilt. Arthur stared at her, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as the catastrophic reality of her words fought against the boundaries of his comprehension. You. Arthur choked out, his eyes darting frantically between Elara and the ledger. You are Vance Holdings' sole proprietor? Elara confirmed, her voice cold as the winter sea. Every penny of the debt you accrued trying to play the Grand Duke. Every mortgage on this land. Every lien on the artwork in this house. The very chair your mother is sitting on. I bought it all. I absorbed your failures, Arthur, to protect your fragile, pathetic pride. I kept the roof over your head. A collective gasp echoed around the room. The aristocrats who had laughed at her last night were now staring at her in sheer, unadulterated horror. They were sitting inside a foreclosed house, eating food bought with her money. That is a lie! Eleanor shrieked, struggling to stand up, her face purple with rage. She is a penniless nobody. This is a trick, a forgery. Arthur, call our lawyers. Have them arrested for fraud. Mr. Sterling did not even look at the Dowager Duchess. He simply tapped the red wax seal on the document. Tweaker, this is an execution order from the High Court of London verified at dawn. The Duke of Ashford signed the collateral agreements 3 years ago. He pledged the entirety of the Halverton estate, inclusive of all physical assets, properties, and liquid accounts against the debt. Sterling looked directly at Arthur. As of 5 a.m., the Halverton estate no longer exists as a legal entity. This property and everything inside it belongs entirely to Ms. Elara Vance. You are currently trespassing on private property. Arthur collapsed back into his chair. His legs simply gave out. He looked at the High Court seal, the undeniable, irrefutable proof of his absolute destruction. His hands began to shake violently. He looked at the golden pocket watch resting on the table, the symbol of his lineage, suddenly realizing it was just another item on Elara's inventory list. Elara. Arthur whispered, his voice cracking, the arrogant baritone completely shattered. Please, you cannot do this. This is my home. This is my family's legacy. 400 years. It ceased to be your legacy the moment you handed me a charity check and told me I was unworthy of it. Elara replied, her expression unyielding. Cecilia, finally, grasping the terrifying magnitude of the situation, leaped up from her chair. Her sweet doll-like facade evaporated into raw, ugly panic. Arthur, what is she talking about? Tell her she is lying. You told my father the estate was secure. You told him the Halverton name was flawless. Elara turned her gaze to Cecilia. She looked at the young heiress with a mixture of pity and supreme boredom. He lied to you, Cecilia. He lied to your father. He is bankrupt. He has been bankrupt for years. He proposed to you solely to use your family's money to pay me off. though looking at the math.
The debts
Elara tilted her head slightly. Your dowry wouldn't have covered even half the principal. Cecilia let out a sharp, hysterical sob. She looked at Arthur, who was staring blankly at the table, a broken, empty shell of a man. She looked down at the massive diamond ring on her finger. And that ring, Elara added softly, noting Cecilia's gaze. He bought it on a secondary line of credit under the estate's name, which means legally that diamond is an asset belonging to Vance Holdings. I suggest you take it off Cecilia. The bailiffs are very meticulous about inventory. Cecilia gasped as if she had been burned. She frantically tore the ring from her finger and threw it onto the table. It clattered against the fine china, a meaningless piece of glass in a room entirely stripped of its illusions. Elara looked around the grand morning room. She saw Lord Harrington sweating profusely. She saw the Dowager Duchess Eleanor trembling, her silver-headed cane suddenly looking very fragile. She saw the dozens of aristocratic parasites who had spent their lives mocking her, now trapped in a house she owned, facing the cold, undeniable reality of her power. You have exactly 1 hour,
No!
Elara announced, her voice ringing with absolute, terrifying authority. 1 hour to pack a single suitcase of your personal clothing. No jewelry, no art, no Halverton heirlooms. If you are not off my property by 9:30 a.m., the bailiffs will physically remove you. Mr. Sterling supervised the eviction. With pleasure, Miss Vance, Sterling replied, gesturing for the bailiffs to step forward. Elara did not wait to watch them scramble. She turned her back on the ruined duke, the weeping heiress, and the stunned aristocrats. She walked out of the morning room, her emerald velvet suit catching the light, her footsteps echoing through the grand hall. She had promised them that by dawn they would be begging, and as the first cries of panic and despair erupted behind her, Elara knew the best part of her revenge was that she wasn't even going to stay to listen to it. The grand portico of the Halverton estate, usually reserved for the majestic arrival of dignitaries and royalty, had been transformed into a staging ground for a spectacular, humiliating exodus. Elara stood at the top of the wide stone steps framed by the towering marble columns of the main entrance. The morning air was bitterly cold, the kind of crisp, unforgiving chill that stripped the leaves from the ancient oak trees lining the driveway. She did not feel the cold. The heavy, emerald green velvet of her tailored suit wrapped around her, like a suit of armor, her dark auburn hair catching the pale, blinding sunlight that was finally breaking through the heavy autumn clouds. Below her, the sprawling gravel courtyard was a scene of controlled, agonizing chaos. The royal bailiffs, overseen by the clinical and ruthless Mr. Sterling, were enforcing the 1-hour eviction notice with brutal efficiency. The aristocrats, the politicians, the wealthy elite who had laughed at Elara the night before were now streaming out of the massive front doors. They looked like refugees in tailored clothing. Each of them carried a single modest suitcase, the exact limitation Arthur had smugly forced upon Elara just 12 hours prior. Lord Harrington walked past the bottom of the stairs, struggling with a heavy leather valise. He did not look up. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the wet gravel, his face flushed with the deep, burning shame of a man who had just realized his entire social order was a fragile, easily shattered illusion. Elara watched them go with absolute, unfeeling stillness. She felt no triumph in their individual humiliations. They were merely the audience. The true tragedy was reserved for the family that had built this stage. A commotion near the base of the steps drew her attention. Celia Montgomery burst through the grand doors, her face streaked with mascara, her carefully curled blonde hair disheveled by panic. She was struggling to drag a heavy designer trunk behind her. A bailiff stepped into her path, placing a firm gloved hand on the trunk. One suitcase only miscovered, the bailiff stated flatly. The remaining luggage is now the property of Vance Holdings. You cannot do this! Cecilia shrieked, her voice shrill and entirely devoid of its former sweet musical cadence. These are my clothes! These are silks from Paris! Everything left in the estate is collateral. The bailiff repeated, entirely unmoved. Step away from the trunk, or you will be escorted off the premises without anything at all. Cecilia, wait. Arthur stumbled out of the mansion, chasing after the young heiress. He looked physically destroyed. The tailored tweed morning jacket hung loosely on his shoulders. His pale grey eyes were wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. He reached out and grabbed Cecilia's arm. Cecilia, please! Arthur begged, his voice cracking. Do not leave like this. My lawyers... I will call my lawyers. Your father has influence in the High Court. We can challenge the demand notice. We can reverse this. Just give me time. Challenge it with what, Arthur? Cecilia spat, her blue eyes blazing with fury. You have nothing. You lied to me. You lied to my family. You told my father the Holverton estate was an impenetrable fortress of wealth, and you were nothing but a desperate bankrupt beggar trying to use my dowry to pay off your invisible wife. I love you. Arthur pleaded a desperate hollow lie that echoed pitifully across the courtyard. We can start over. Cecilia laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Love, I was buying a dukedom, Arthur. I was buying a legacy. I was not buying a drowning man. Do not ever contact me or my family again. She turned her back on him, abandoning the designer trunk. She grabbed a small travel bag from her trembling maid and marched toward the modest hired carriage the bailiffs had arranged for the evicted guests. She climbed inside, slamming the door shut without a single backward glance. Arthur stood on the wet gravel, his arms hanging limply at his sides, watching the carriage roll down the long oak-lined driveway. The engine of his salvation had just abandoned him. Move along, your grace. Arthur flinched as two bailiffs escorted an elderly woman out onto the portico. It was the Dowager Duchess Eleanor. She looked 10 years older than she had at the breakfast table. The heavy layer of white powder on her face was cracking. She leaned heavily on her silver-headed cane, her breathing shallow and ragged. The imposing, cruel matriarch, who had terrorized the household for decades, had been reduced to a fragile, shivering old woman. She carried a small, worn carpet bag. The bailiffs had meticulously stripped her of her heavy pearl necklaces and her diamond brooches, correctly identifying them as collateral belonging to Vance Holdings. Eleanor stopped at the top of the stairs directly beside Elara. For a moment, the old woman turned her head. Her dark, beady eyes met Elara's. She opened her mouth, perhaps to hurl one final insult, perhaps to curse the woman who had brought her meaty dynasty to its knees. But looking into Elara's glacial, empty eyes, Eleanor's courage broke. The Dowager Duchess swallowed hard, her mouth closing into a tight, trembling line. She lowered her head and began the slow, agonizing descent down the stone steps, leaning on her cane, vanishing into the cold mist toward a waiting cab. The courtyard was emptying quickly. The luxury cars of the elite guests were gone. The bailiffs were securing the perimeter of the estate, locking the heavy iron gates one by one. Arthur Halverton was left entirely alone at the bottom of the grand staircase. He looked around the sprawling, magnificent property that had borne his family's name for 4 centuries. He looked at the manicured lawns, the stone fountains, the towering, majestic architecture. He looked at the life that had been his absolute birthright slipping through his fingers like dry sand. Finally, slowly he raised his head and looked up at the top of the stairs. Elara was standing there looking down at him. She did not look triumphant. She did not look angry. She looked at him with the terrifying clinical detachment of a scientist observing a dying insect. Arthur took a step forward. His legs were shaking so violently he could barely support his own weight. He took another step, then another. He began to climb the stone stairs, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. When he was 3 steps below her, his knees finally gave out. Arthur collapsed onto the hard, freezing stone. The fabric of his expensive tweed trousers scraped against the rough masonry. He did not try to stand back up. He knelt before her, his head bowed, his hands gripping the edge of the step just inches from her sharp, black leather boots. "Elara?" Arthur whispered, and the sound was broken, choked with tears he could no longer hold back. "Please." She did not move. She looked down at his shaking shoulders, remembering the night 3 years ago in the archives, when she had kissed those very shoulders, and secretly signed away her fortune to save him. The memory felt like it belonged to a different lifetime, to a different foolish girl who was now dead and buried. "Please, Elara!" Arthur sobbed, his voice raw with a desperation so profound it echoed off the marble columns. "I was blind. I was a fool. I let the pressure of this house, the pressure of my mother, twist my mind. I never wanted to hurt you. I was terrified of losing the estate, and I made the worst mistake of my life." He slowly lifted his head. His pale grey eyes were bloodshot, tears streaming down his flushed cheeks. He looked up at her, begging for a sliver of the boundless mercy she had offered him for a decade. "I love you." Arthur wept, his fingers reaching out, trembling, stopping just short of touching the hem of her emerald velvet trousers. "I know I don't deserve it, but I'm begging you. Give me a chance, let me prove it to you. We can run this estate together. You are brilliant, you saved me. Let me be the husband you deserve. I will do anything. Anything. Please do not take my home. Do not leave me with nothing. Elara looked at the broken duke kneeling at her feet. She listened to his desperate, pathetic apologies. She analyzed the cadence of his tears, the angle of his submission, the absolute crushing reality of his public ruin. She felt nothing. There was no satisfaction. There was no joy. There was only a profound, vast emptiness, clean and cold and infinitely peaceful. You do not love me, Arthur. Elara said, her voice soft, floating over the freezing morning air like falling snow. You never did. You loved the comfort I provided. You loved the silence I offered. You loved the fact that I absorbed your burdens, so you could pretend you were strong. Arthur shook his head frantically. No, that isn't true. And you are not mourning the loss of your wife. Elara continued, cutting him off with a chilling lack of effort. You are mourning the loss of your vanity. You are kneeling on these stones not because you regret breaking my heart, but because you are terrified of being poor. Arthur let out a low, agonizing sound, burying his face in his hands. His entire body convulsed with the force of his weeping. The great Duke of Ashford reduced to a sobbing wreck on the steps of a house he no longer owned. Elara reached into the pocket of her velvet blazer. Her long, elegant fingers closed around the vintage silver key. She pulled it out, holding it up so the morning sun caught the tarnished metal. You asked me not to take you home, Elara said quietly. Arthur looked up through his tears, a pathetic, desperate spark of hope igniting in his chest. Yes, please, I will live in the servants' quarters. I will do anything, or just let me stay. This is no longer a home. Arthur, it hasn't been a home for a very long time. It is a tomb. Elara tightened her grip on the silver key. And I have no intention of living in a tomb. Arthur's frantic hope faltered. What do you mean? I am locking the doors today, Elara stated, her voice ringing with absolute unyielding finality. But next spring I am opening them again. To the public. Arthur stared at her, uncomprehending. The public. I'm turning the Halverton country estate into a museum. Elara announced, the cold brilliance of her plan finally snapping into focus. A public exhibit dedicated to aristocratic decay, financial mismanagement, and the collapse of the nobility. Commoners will buy tickets to walk through your dining hall. Tourists will take photographs of your mother's bedroom. School children will read plaques detailing exactly how the great Duke of Ashford bankrupted his legacy to buy a diamond for a woman who left him in the driveway. The words struck Arthur with the force of a physical execution, the color completely drained from his world. A museum. His sacred untouchable lineage turned into a cautionary tale for the working class. His absolute eternal humiliation carved into the very walls of his ancestry. No, Arthur breathed, his voice barely a whisper. You cannot. You wouldn't. I own the walls, Arthur. I can do whatever I please. Elara took a step back. She looked down at him one last time. He was no longer a man. He was just a ghost haunting the steps of a museum that was about to bear his shame. The bailiffs will escort you to the gate now, Mr. Halverton. Elara said, officially stripping him of his title in her presence. I suggest you start walking. It is a long way to London, and you no longer have carriage fare. She turned her back on him. She did not wait for his scream of anguish. She did not listen to the sound of him collapsing completely against the cold stone, weeping for a life that was gone forever. Elara Vance walked across the grand portico toward a sleek, armored black motorcar waiting at the edge of the driveway. Mr. Sterling held the door open for her. She stepped inside, sinking into the plush leather seat. To the city, Mrs. Vance, Sterling asked quietly. To the city, Mr. Sterling. We have an empire to run. The heavy door closed with a solid, satisfying thud. The engine roared to life. As the black car pulled away, tires crunching over the wet gravel, Elara looked straight ahead. She did not glance out the window. She did not look in the rearview mirror to see the broken man sobbing on the steps of the grand estate. She left the ruins of the Halverton legacy behind her in the cold morning mist, a queen who had finally reclaimed her crown driving into the sun utterly beautifully untouchable.